The air inside the escape pod smelled like burnt circuits and something vaguely sweet, probably the coolant leaking from a busted panel. He groaned, shifting against the cramped seat. A soft, frantic voice snapped him back to reality. Finally. You're awake. I thought you were dead, and I was going to have to do this alone. He turned his head. Xylara. His alien stepsister. For golden eyes, purple-tinted skin, and a body built by whatever god designed space pinups. She was gripping the dashboard, her lower lip trembling. What happened? Jake croaked. The pod crashed. The systems are failing. And worse, we're not synced. Jake blinked. Synced? Xylara grabbed his hand, pressing it between hers. I need you to focus. My species, we don't function well under stress unless we have a bonded mate. If I don't sync with someone soon, my body will shut down. Jake squinted. Sync? Like, emotionally? She hesitated. Emotionally, physically, metaphysically. That's a lot of physically, and I don't like where this is going. Xylara's cheeks darkened. It's not like that. The process is natural. Your human biology should respond instinctively once we begin. You'll feel it. Jake didn't trust anything that sounded like mysterious alien biology activating without his consent. The pod's AI flickered on, static hissing through the speakers. Warning, life support failing. Recommended course of action, initiate emergency pair bonding protocol. Jake's stomach dropped. Oh, hell no. Xylara squeezed his hands. Oh, hell yes. He yanked away. I don't even know what that means. Pair bonding? That could mean anything. Xylara frowned. Your people are so dramatic. It's simple. We need physical synchronization. Jake's brain short-circuited. Synchronization. With my stepsister. Xylara groaned. You humans and your weird fixation on that word. Step-siblings are not the same thing in my culture. You were adopted into my clan by convenience, not genetics. Yeah, well, Earth doesn't work that way. Back home, I'd have to clear at least 3 therapy sessions before having this conversation. The AI chimed in again. Further delay will result in neurological impairment. Releasing advisory guidelines for pair bonding success. Jake watched in horror as the screen displayed animated diagrams of suggestive-looking synchronization positions. The hell is this? Xylara studied the display. I don't know. It doesn't look accurate. That limb placement is completely wrong. That's your takeaway? Xylara sighed, rubbing her temples. I was hoping this wouldn't be difficult. Humans complicate everything. Jake exhaled sharply, trying to focus on literally anything else. The pod's status report was flashing red. Oxygen levels were down to 28%. Outside, the sensors detected movement. Something big and hungry-looking. Okay. Priorities. I don't suppose we could, I don't know, solve this another way? Jake asked. Xylara bit her lip. Theoretically, yes. But it would require sustained close contact. Preferably skin to skin. Jake gave her a look. You're just making this worse on purpose now. I'm serious. I need to stabilize my biochemistry before my body starts shutting down unnecessary functions. Like vision. Or motor control. As if to prove her point, her legs wobbled, and she grabbed his arm to steady herself. Jake swore under his breath. Additional note, failure to pair bond may result in extreme physiological discomfort for all parties. Jake scowled. That's a fancy way of saying we're gonna suffer. Xylara's fingers twitched against his arm. It's already happening. Jake sighed through his nose. All right. Fine. What exactly do I need to do? Xylara visibly relaxed. Hold me. That's it? For now. He hesitated, then awkwardly wrapped his arms around her. She shuddered. Oh. Okay. That's okay. Jake frowned. You're acting like you didn't think this would work. I wasn't sure. Your biology is strange. The AI beeped. Partial synchronization achieved. Initiating next stage. Jake tensed. Next stage? The pod lurched as something heavy landed on top of it. A deep, guttural growl vibrated through the hole. XY inhaled sharply. We have another problem. Jake gritted his teeth. Oh, great. Because this wasn't already stressful enough. Another clawing sound. Recommendation, remain still. External threat detected. XY buried her face against his chest. This is fine. This is totally fine. Jake looked down at her trembling body. Despite everything, he felt protective instincts kicking in. All right, he muttered, tightening his grip. If we die in here, I'm haunting that AI. XY let out a tiny, relieved sigh. Deal. The sound of claws scraping against metal echoed through the escape pod. Jake's breath quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. XY was still pressed against him, her alien body trembling slightly as she clung to his chest. He couldn't decide whether it was the external threat or their strange bonding ritual that made his heart race. I thought we were sinking, Jake said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. His voice cracked as the pod shook again. The growl outside deepened, sending a shiver down his spine. We are, XY whispered. We're making progress. It's just, well, my species takes a while to fully stabilize. You'll feel the difference soon. Trust me. Jake was starting to feel something all right, uncomfortable, but not in the way she meant. It wasn't just a weirdly intimate situation, it was the fact that XY's body felt warmer against his, her scent sweet like something he couldn't quite place. His mind was spinning between terror and something else that was definitely not fear. Can we, speed up the process? We're kind of about to be eaten by whatever's out there, he muttered, trying to keep it together. XY's eyes fluttered open. The predator outside is detecting our fear. If we're too tense, we'll make it worse. Great, Jake replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Because nothing calms a predator down like two humans, or one human and one alien, hugging it out. XY shot him a glance, her expression unreadable. You're very touchy for someone trying to survive. Yeah? Well, this whole bonding thing wasn't in the manual, Jake snapped. You humans are so quick to assume the worst. It's only a biological process. Our core energies align. Once we're in sync, my body will stabilize. Core energies. Jake repeated, half laughing. We talking about chakras here, or? It's not like that. XY snapped, pushing off him and standing up. The sudden coldness of her absence hit Jake like a slap to the face, but he quickly focused on the clawing sounds growing louder outside. He had no time for whatever that was. Get back here. We don't have time for this. Jake growled, standing up. He wasn't about to let alien monsters get the better of him, no matter how bizarre the situation. XY turned and stared at him, her eyes wide. You don't understand. I need you to initiate the second stage. If you don't, I won't be able to. Second stage? Jake interrupted, confused. What the hell does that even mean? Her voice lowered, tinged with desperation. We need physical closeness. The stress is overwhelming. If you're not ready, I won't survive. Jake's heart hammered in his chest. Wait, what? What happens if we don't bond? The bond is not just emotional, she said, her tone now quieter, more serious. It's physical too. You'll feel it when it's right. She took a step closer, her fingers twitching as if unsure whether to touch him or not. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but his brain was momentarily short-circuited by the closeness. The air between them was thick, charged with something he couldn't explain. His body felt like it was betraying him, and he didn't like it one bit. Look, I really don't get this, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. I'm just a guy. I'm not. Xylara's gaze softened, but her voice was tinged with urgency. You are a mate. A pair bond is necessary for my species to survive this process. My biology is out of balance without it. You don't have to do much. Just... Her words trailed off as she reached out and placed her hand on his chest, just above his heart. The contact sent a strange pulse through him, a warm, tingling sensation that made his head spin. I swear, I'm not trying to make this weird, Xylara muttered, looking up at him. But it's either this, or we die. I die. Jake swallowed hard. The urgency in her voice was real. This wasn't some alien prank. She was in real danger. And whatever her species did to bond, it seemed vital. All right, he finally muttered. Let's get this over with, then. But I swear, if this turns into some weird alien mating ritual, I'm going to need a vacation. Xylara's expression softened, just a hint of a smile forming. Deal. Jake braced himself, trying to ignore the voice in his head that was screaming at him to run. This was crazy, completely insane, but it wasn't like they had a choice. The pod systems were failing, oxygen was running low, and those predators outside were only getting closer. Xylara's hand slipped down, resting over his abdomen, just above his waist. It was a strange sensation, her warmth against his body, but there was something else there, some kind of unnatural pulse of energy that he couldn't comprehend. I'm doing this because you said you needed to survive, okay? Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. He wasn't sure if it was the danger, the weird tingling in his chest, or just the fact that Xylara had practically crawled into his lap, but he wasn't thinking straight. Xylara nodded. Yes. It's necessary. For both of us. She moved closer, and Jake's breath hitched. It wasn't like he hadn't been around women before, he was a human, after all, but this was something else entirely. Just make sure I don't pass out, all right? Jake said, trying to make light of it, though it didn't help much. I'll try, she said softly, her breath warm against his neck. I promise. And then, the alien predator's growl rattled the pod again, louder this time, and for a split second, everything felt wrong. But as Xylara's hands moved against him, everything else faded out. The outside world, the pod's alarms, the strange alien energy she radiated, all of it melted into a single, overwhelming need to survive. To sink, even if they both had no idea what the hell that meant. And maybe, just maybe, the strangest part of all was that Jake didn't mind. Jake's mind was spiraling. Xylara's body pressed so closely to his was enough to send his thoughts into a blur. He tried to focus, but all he could think about was the warmth of her skin, the pulse of energy humming through the air, and the terrifying growls of something dangerous outside. His heart pounded as her fingers traced patterns across his chest. I thought you said this was necessary, he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. Xylara's eyes flickered to his, her golden irises wide with a mix of determination and desperation. It is, she said, her voice low. My species needs a mate to stabilize. You feel it too, don't you? The connection? Jake had no idea what was happening, but his body was betraying him. There was a pull he couldn't resist, a physical need to be close to her that he couldn't explain. His instincts were screaming, his hands moving almost on their own accord, but his mind was still locked in disbelief. This couldn't be happening, not like this, not with his stepsister, but his body didn't care about those details. He cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. Yeah, well, this whole bonding thing isn't exactly what I had in mind for my first alien encounter. Xylara's lips quirked upward. I would hope not. But we can only work with what we have. She moved closer, her body fitting against his like it was meant to be there, and he couldn't help but tense at the feel of her hands sliding up his torso. Xylara, this is not, he stopped himself, unsure what to say. Her closeness was making it harder to think. This isn't the solution, is it? You can't just bond with me and expect everything to magically be okay. Not magically, she replied, her voice soft, but the urgency was clear. It's not about magic, Jake. It's about biology. She placed her palm over his chest again, her eyes glowing slightly as she focused on the touch. Humans and aliens aren't so different after all. We just need each other to survive in moments like this. Her words were heavy with meaning, and Jake felt the gravity of them, even if his mind refused to wrap itself around the full picture. Yeah? Well, if that's true, then how come every part of me is screaming to run away from this? Xylara's mouth twitched. You're not the first human to think that. You're not the first person to fight the instincts when it comes to survival. But you'll learn to trust it. I know you will. Jake swallowed, his hands growing sweaty as her warmth spread through him. The alien energy she mentioned was tangible, something he could feel deep in his bones, not just in his head. It was strange, and it made his heart race in a way that felt dangerous. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or scream. So, what? We're just gonna hug it out until I get this sinking thing right? Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. The situation was becoming ridiculous, but he wasn't stupid. If this was truly the only way to survive, he had no choice but to try. Not just hug. It's more than that, Xylara said, her tone deepening, a more serious edge creeping into her words. The more contact we share, the stronger the bond becomes. The energy, it compounds. Jake blinked. Compounds? Are you telling me this is like some sort of alien battery? Xylara snorted, but it wasn't the amused chuckle he was used to hearing. It was more like an exhale of relief, and it made Jake's stomach tighten. Not quite. But it is essential. We need to stay close, for our own well-being. My body will stabilize, and yours will adjust too. Jake shook his head. I'm not sure I'm following. Are we talking about survival, or are you trying to turn this into a weird alien relationship? Xylara paused, looking at him with a mix of frustration and sincerity. It's not a relationship in the way you mean. It's more like a life-saving connection. The physical synchronization will balance our energies and stabilize us. I can't explain it more simply than that. Jake wanted to argue, to fight the absurdity of it all. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw that the situation was worse than he wanted to admit. Her breathing had become more erratic. Sweat dotted her brow, and her eyes, which were usually so confident, now held something far more vulnerable, desperation. She was relying on him, in a way that felt both overwhelming and strangely intimate. He took a deep breath, holding on to his last shred of sanity. All right. Fine. If this really is the only way to keep us both alive, then let's do it. I'm not in the mood to die in some space pod, bonding with my stepsister just to save my skin. But I'm still not convinced this is the answer. Xylara nodded, her expression softening just enough to show a glimpse of relief. You'll see. It's not perfect, but it works. Her voice dropped to a near whisper as her fingers traced the edge of his sleeve. And right now, we're running out of time. The pod shook again, this time harder. The claws scraping the hull were getting closer, and the growl from outside reverberated through the walls. Jake could practically feel the vibration in his bones. This wasn't just a random alien predator, this was a predator who was sensing their fear, and it was hungry. With a sigh, Jake pulled her back against him, feeling the warmth of her body once again, more present than ever. He knew he couldn't back out now. If survival meant doing something unbelievable and completely insane, then so be it. This better work, he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. Xylara's lips quirked again. It will. Just trust the process. Yeah, well, trusting you is the easy part. I'm still trying to figure out if I'm about to kiss you or pass out. She blinked, her gaze flicking to his lips, then back to his eyes. There was a flicker of something there, amusement, perhaps. Or maybe something more, but before either of them could make sense of it, the growl outside shifted into a louder, more threatening roar. "We're out of time," Xylara whispered. Her hands gripped his shoulders as she leaned in closer, their faces almost touching now. "We need this to work, Jake." And before he could answer, she closed the distance, pressing her lips to his in a way that was both alien and familiar, urgent and gentle, and all-consuming in a way he couldn't understand but felt every inch of. Everything went quiet in that moment. It wasn't peace, but it was a connection. For once, Jake let himself feel the pull. Jake was no longer sure what to think. His lips were still tingling from the kiss, though he didn't know whether that was the alien energy or just the aftermath of what was happening between them. Xylara was still pressed against him, her breath quick and shallow, and the moment she pulled away, her expression was unreadable, but he could feel the shift. Something was different. "Is it working?" Jake asked, his voice strained. He didn't know what else to say. The whole thing felt like a dream, or a nightmare. One moment, he was trying to survive some alien invasion, and the next, he was kissing his stepsister in a desperate attempt to bond and survive. His heart was still pounding, and his mind was struggling to catch up with reality. Xylara nodded, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "It's working. Just give it a minute. The process is still adapting." She shifted slightly, still holding onto him, but her grip was lighter now, less urgent. Jake tried to focus on the situation outside, but the predator's growls were growing louder again, and he could feel the walls of the escape pod trembling with each heavy breath the creature took. He didn't know how much longer they could last. Oxygen was running low, and their life support system was on the brink of failure. He needed to think, but his brain kept circling back to the undeniable chemistry that had just exploded between them. Was this real? Was he really going to bond with her like this? "Xylara, you sure this is the only way?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. The situation felt surreal, and he needed reassurance that there wasn't some other way to survive that didn't involve his very personal involvement in her survival. She met his eyes, her gaze serious. "Yes, Jake. You're the one. I won't survive without the bond." Her words were quieter now, tinged with something softer, almost vulnerable. She had been pushing for this, for the connection, but there was no denying the gravity in her tone. It wasn't just some alien ritual, it was a matter of life and death. Jake rubbed his face, trying to keep it together. Okay, I get it. But why does it have to feel like this?" He gestured vaguely between them, feeling the awkward tension that had shifted into something far more complicated. Her expression softened, and she touched his cheek gently, almost as if she were reassuring him. "You'll get used to it. Our species, we're adaptive. The process might feel uncomfortable at first, but soon, it will make sense. It's the only way to balance our energies, to make sure we're both okay." He nodded, though he wasn't convinced. The predator was still circling, and their time was running out. He looked at the control panel, the flashing warnings on the screen, and the growing anxiety that bubbled in his chest. But something shifted then. The energy between them wasn't just a biological necessity, it was also something more intangible, something he couldn't quite explain. "I think I'm starting to feel it," Jake muttered, his fingers curling against her waist without realizing it. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to feel a connection or just confusion, but there was definitely something happening. The pull was stronger now, more pronounced. Xylara's eyes flickered with an almost imperceptible smile. "Good. It means you're adjusting." She leaned in closer again, her lips brushing his ear as she spoke. "Trust me, once the bond is fully formed, it will feel natural. You'll know everything you need to know. Our survival depends on it." Jake shivered at the sensation of her breath against his skin. Part of him wanted to pull back, to remind himself that this was wrong on so many levels, but the other part, the part that was suddenly so aware of her, wanted to stay. Needed to stay. His thoughts felt fuzzy, as though something was shifting within him. It was a kind of mental fog that made his body respond to her in ways he couldn't control. "All right," Jake said with a sigh, the weight of the situation sinking in. "I'll do this." but you better be right about this whole bond thing. He tried to sound confident, though his voice cracked at the end, betraying his uncertainty. Lara looked at him, her eyes now filled with warmth, but there was also a seriousness in them that he couldn't ignore. I'm right, she said softly, her hands sliding up to his shoulders once more. We'll be okay. Trust me. The moment felt suspended in time, both of them caught between survival and something far more intimate. The growls outside were still there, but now, Jake wasn't sure which threat was more pressing, the alien predator or the intense connection building between them. Then, suddenly, the escape pod lurched violently, throwing them both off balance. The predator outside had found a weak spot in the hull. The pod began to shake violently, and the alarms blared louder than ever, signaling the failure of the life support systems. We don't have much time, Jake said, trying to steady himself. He grabbed Lara's hand, his fingers tightening around hers as the pod shook again, louder this time. We need to get out of here, or we'll both be space food. Lara nodded, her face tightening in determination. She moved quickly, pulling him with her toward the emergency escape pods. But even as they moved, Jake could feel the pull of the bond growing stronger, the tingling sensation intensifying. It wasn't just her presence now, he could feel her energy merging with his, and the longer they stayed together, the more it settled into place. There was no denying it. The bond was real. He could feel it in his chest, in the pit of his stomach. I guess this is really happening, Jake said under his breath, almost to himself. Lara glanced at him, a smirk playing at the edges of her lips. What did I tell you? We're in this together. Now, let's get through this, and then you can start getting used to me. Jake couldn't help but chuckle, despite the absurdity of it all. Yeah, well, after this whole bonding thing, I'm starting to think you might just be stuck with me. Lara's eyes shone with something between amusement and affection. Maybe I am, she said, pulling him closer as the pod continued to shake. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. The growls outside were closer now, but Jake didn't feel the same panic he had moments ago. He felt centered, in a way. A way that he couldn't explain. The bond wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper. They were connected, whether they liked it or not. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing either.